Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Welcome to the Michelle Meow Show at the Commonwealth Club of California. I'm John Zipper, the club's Vice President of Media and Editorial, and your co-host for today's program. Now, we hope you're staying safe and are well wherever you are, and we look forward to seeing you in person again one day at the Commonwealth Club's headquarters in San Francisco when it's safe to do so. Until that happens, we are doing all of our programming online. This is the latest in more than 400 online programs the club has produced during the pandemic. You can find all of our upcoming programs, as well as podcasts and video from our past events at commonwealthclub.org. Now, if you're watching us live on YouTube, use the chat box to submit questions for our special guest today, and we'll work some of those into our conversation, which appropriately enough is taking place during lunchtime here on the West Coast. Now, I want to introduce Michelle Meow. She's the producer and the host of The Michelle Meow Show and a member of the Commonwealth Club's Board of Governors. Good to see you again, Michelle.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you to the Commonwealth Club of California for bringing thought leaders together. Our guest today is John Birdsall, who grew up near San Francisco and learned to cook at Green's Restaurant. He spent the next 17 years in professional kitchens in San Francisco and in Chicago and did some writings as a side gig, including food stories and restaurant reviews for the San Francisco Sentinel, a pioneering LGBTQ weekly. After leaving the kitchen, he was a restaurant critic and features writer at the Contra Costa Times and East Bay Express, and also served as the editor of San Francisco Weekly's food blog. In 2014, he won a James Beard Award for Food and Culture Writer for America, Your Food is So Gay in Lucky Peach, and another in 2016 for Straight Up Passing in queer food journal Jari. He's written for Food and Wine, Bon Appetit, the San Francisco Chronicle, and LA Times, but today he is here to talk about his book, The Man Who Ate Too Much, The Life of James Beard. Let's welcome John Birdsall to the program. John, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Michelle.
So many folks like me who like good food and know of good food only because, we go to these restaurants and we know of chefs that have received a James Beard Award. We actually don't really know, James Beard, the person, and what his name actually means. I mean, we know he's a chef, he's an author, he's a television personality, but very rarely do we talk about the fact that James was not an out gay man. Right. I'll read a little bit of what you wrote in the preface included in the book. Queerness wasn't just an interesting footnote to Beard's life. Queerness was its central principle, the fact around which Beard organized his existence. But yet it was a part of James Beard's life he chose to keep very quiet. So why don't we start with that? James Beard, celebrated man who moved American kitchens from TV frozen dinners to locally sourced food, good food. He was actually a gay man who felt he had to be closeted.
Yeah, very much because of the times he lived. He was born in 1903 in Portland, Oregon, died in 1985 in New York City. And in that span of a life, spanning nearly the whole 20th century, it was a very, very difficult, very challenging time for LGBTQ Americans. And if you were as famous as James Beard was, and also happened to be queer, it was especially perilous. He became a household name starting in the 1950s, well through the 1980s. He had a very long reign as the most identifiable authority on food, drink, and entertaining in America. But at the same time, he really did have to hide who he was. So it was a life spent in a lot of sort of lying about who he was, about sort of creating these myths about who he was, but not really showing his fans how he lived, who he spent his time with, how he entertained in private. But yeah, the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, I used to have this feeling that American food was kind of idyllic and pastoral, that it was all a food culture of small farms and, great pre-industrial food. But American food in the 20th century, really early in the 20th century, had really been industrialized. And by the time James Beard wrote his first book in 1940, American food was really dominated by large food corporations, General Mills, and these companies who would write cookbooks that were, the cookbooks that most Americans bought. And they talked about a lot of things. They talked about nutrition. They talked about, cooking within a budget, and cooking within the traditional family. Women were expected to do all this cooking. But what they didn't talk about was cooking for flavor. Things that we take for granted, which is to, find good ingredients, maybe at a farmer's market. Those things didn't exist in the 1950s. And buying food that was in season, and learning how to cook it to kind of preserve its wonderful freshness and flavor. Those things were all essentially unknown except to a very, very small group of people in America in the 1940s and 50s. And James Beard really came along and popularized that. He really advocated for Americans to cook with an eye to flavor, to change the way they shopped, to kind of resist these huge gleaming supermarkets, which were, in some ways the great accomplishment of America after the Second World War. And James Beard said, well, even if you live in New York City, you could probably find a farmer, on the outskirts of the metropolis who is raising chickens in the old-fashioned way, and you could buy eggs from him, and you'll see the difference. Told people to grow things in gardens, even on their fire escapes, to grow food. So many things that we take for granted now, farm to table, definitely. He was an early advocate, and perhaps the architect of this sort of farm to table culture that we take for granted now.
He became such a giant figure in bringing about that change you're discussing. Let's start at the beginning, like your book does, with his childhood and in particular his parents. Tell us about that and what role maybe that had in shaping the man he became.
Yeah, he was born into a middle-class family in Portland, Oregon. But he learned from a really early age, he learned two things. One, he learned from his mother, who was a queer woman, that there was a way to express queerness if you hid it. And he also learned from his mother that there was a way to express all of the things that you couldn't do perhaps in your normal life. Since you had to appear straight from the outside, that food could be this sort of tremendous vehicle for expressing all of this passion and creativity and longing that you couldn't do in your public life. So his mother was from England. She had come and settled in Portland. She was a governess for a wealthy family, ended up in Portland. Had an affair, a major affair with a woman in San Francisco. She had come to San Francisco to run a boarding house, and she met this aspiring actress, and they had a long affair, even sort of ran off together at one point. But of course, it being the 19th century, it wasn't really possible for people to do that. Women especially needed to, were expected to live according to strong conventions. And that meant having a husband. And so Elizabeth Beard, James's mother, took a husband, a man named John Beard. There was no love in the marriage. They could barely stand to be in the same room with each other. And so James grew up with this model of family that was really dysfunctional and broken. And all of his mother's love, all of her joy was something that she couldn't express publicly. And so James absorbed that lesson from early on. And one of the ways that his mother sort of made life bearable was to cook this kind of amazing, wonderful food from food that she grew herself in their large backyard in Portland, but also she was very keen on marketing, going to farmers markets, having arrangements with farmers to churn butter for her, and all of this really elaborate, lavish world around food and its preparation. And they had a summer cottage on the coast south of Astoria in a town called Gearhart. And James and his mother would go there in summers to get away from John Beard. And James sort of, his mother would sort of cater, cookouts on the beach. And James, meanwhile, was able to sort of sneak away and, fish for crawfish in the creeks and catch little Dungeness crabs on the beach and pick wild berries. And so it was this kind of grounding in ingredients and the food and ingredients that are so special that come from a particular locale. Again, as I said, really the roots of the farm to table movement. You can see them in James's early childhood education with his mother and at the beach. So it was really idyllic in many ways, his childhood, but at the same time, it was very painful. He was very lonely, spent a lot of time by himself.
I want to build on that. It kind of made me wonder. I mean, he had that great rooting, forgive the term, and these local and great ingredients and such. I mean, I'm wondering how you think it affects how him comes to think about cooking and food when his mother ran a boarding house, she did this catering. How you come to think of it, doing it for customers, for a different type of audience than your family, for example, because they're going to eat whatever you give them. Do you think that it makes you look at the food and the cooking in a different way?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, James is, even as an adult, even when he became sort of famous as, the preeminent food authority in America, his books, certainly his cooking classes, they all had this sort of performative quality to them. And of course, he was a frustrated actor and opera singer. He grew up, even starting in high school, wanting to be on the stage, wanting to be an actor, and then later thinking that he could become a great opera tenor. That didn't work out. He didn't quite have the talent to make it, but he had this grounding in theater, in sort of putting on a character, and his food was very much a product of that. I mean, food was sort of a last resort for James Beard after he'd failed in theater and opera. He had moved to New York City. He was living in Hell's Kitchen, a large apartment building where a lot of queer people who worked on Broadway, actors, stagehands, costume makers. And he found that he could throw great parties. He could take not very much money, and with a lot of ingenuity, a lot of charm and panache, he could throw great parties. So he became known for that. So, as I see it, there's this merging of food, of theater, and of queerness. All three really come together superbly in James Beard, and create this kind of great persona, this great figure in American food who would take all of those things and make them and kind of mainstream them. But of course, the queerness was something that was just below the surface, but was definitely a huge engine of his whole approach to food and entertaining.
Which makes it, very interesting in that, this is a unique story. He grew up with a lot of culture, food, theater, and queer culture. And even his mom, and you had mentioned it, being, I think, queer. I don't know if that was actually ever made, or was the actual truth. But yeah, he was closeted. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. I mean, I think that he had written at some point that he knew he was gay at 8 years old, somewhere around that.
Right. Yeah. He said that much later in life, as he was sort of looking back, and he felt that he should come out publicly before he died. So he was kind of musing with a friend who was interviewing him, and sort of came up, with this reminiscence that he realized that at 7 or 8, that he was definitely gay, which is, a very common experience. I mean, that's probably about the time that I, felt that I was gay. I didn't understand it at the time, but sort of later I went back and was like, oh yeah, that's totally what that was. So yeah, it was for James, it was never in doubt who he was attracted to, his sexuality. What was in doubt was how he could express it, how he could live in the world. And a large part of doing the research for this book for me was understanding queerness, understanding sexuality at a time when all the assumptions and pretty much all the practices, all of people's public behavior was completely different than anything that I ever understood. I mean, I grew up feeling, anyone I think who grew up post-Stonewall, who came out post-Stonewall, has this sense of queerness as a kind of binary, that you are either, not out yet or you're out. And for Americans, through most of the 20th century, it wasn't as simple as that. It was, there was a very complicated, coded reality for queer people where you had to couch your behavior, you had to couch your speech in this careful coding, where you could, deny that you were queer in public, and you could pursue a queer life, especially, of course, in a big city. But you had to do it carefully. You had to know when and where and how to do it, how to even speak to people in ways that didn't put anyone's safety, including your own, at risk. And one of the things I struggled with in the book was whether or not to, what word to describe James Beard. Was it queer? Was it gay? And it occurred to me at some point that, having a name for yourself, calling out, having a public title for your status, for your sexuality, is actually a luxury, and it's something that a lot of people in the 20th century, the earlier 20th century, didn't even have. Like, they wouldn't have a name for themselves. They wouldn't say I'm queer. They might say, in queer circles, they could joke that they were queens, that they were pansies, that they were fairies. But it's not like you necessarily had a term for what you were. You just knew that you were special, you were different, and there were many other people like you, but you had to be very careful about finding them and about being with them. So James Beard had an extremely complicated sexuality, very complicated life of queerness, and even just the ways that he could talk about it were very complex. Yeah.
Actually, I was going to say, John, it reminds me of the story of Bobby Cutler, the first Secretary of State to President Eisenhower or Roosevelt. Sorry, National Security Advisor. Yes, and came up with a policy, or the actual policy, to fire anybody accused of being LGBT, in the federal government, and nobody knew that he actually was a gay man himself. So you talk about a very defined, point of American history, and now, but in the food world. John?
Along these lines, we were talking about, what term might be applied to him. And of course, gay itself is a term that has another meaning, which is happiness or happy. And I just want to go off on this of all the stuff he's done, all the things he's dealt with throughout his life. Toward the end of it, do you think he had a happy life? Was he happy with what he had done and with himself?
I don't believe that he was. I spoke with friends of his who were close to him in the last couple of decades of his life and said, well, James had suffered from depression his whole life. And he managed it, partly through drinking. He didn't consider himself an alcoholic, but he did everything with food and drink in excess. And I think that was definitely part of managing it. He also took medications. There's a popular one in the 1950s called Miltown, sort of a tranquilizer. So James would take that. But he would just have these horrible periods of depression where he wouldn't be able to work. And he was someone who worked a lot. He was constantly, it was rare for him to say no to any project. And towards the end of his life, I think it became even harder for him to push that away. So at some point in the early 1970s, a good friend of his said that his mood really changed. And he was very pessimistic about the future. He felt in many ways that he didn't accomplish that much, that he wished that he had been able to accomplish more. And he didn't really want to leave anything of himself behind. He specified that all of his possession, he was this great collector of kitchen and other kinds of antiques. And his townhouse in New York City was just packed with these amazing, Victorian Majolica plates and, this huge knife, antique knife collection that he'd amassed and all this stuff. And he didn't want to save any of it. He didn't want to give it away. He, specified that it all be auctioned off. His house sold. It's ironic that the James Beard Foundation, which was formed after he died, kind of wouldn't let James Beard die the way wouldn't let him disappear the way that he wanted to. But yeah, no, I think, apart from his depression, I think, it was very complicated to him for him to conduct his life, as a famous person who couldn't really express who he was in public. And I think that was just part of the one of the stresses sort of pushing in on him that sort of caused his depression. So yeah, he was not. He was kind of a sad, kind of tragic figure toward the end of his life, for sure.
Let's talk about the LGBTQ movement and how James Beard may have been impacted or affected, or what he thought about that. I mean, I think that he lived right near Stonewall Inn when the Stonewall riots happened.
He did.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, he lived just a couple of blocks from the Stonewall Inn. He lived on West 12th Street in New York City. It's still, the house is called James Beard House now. It's owned by the James Beard Foundation. Yeah, and in fact, he was in New York City for the nights when the Stonewall Rebellion happened. There's no evidence that he, went to take a look, but he would have heard it very clearly from his house. But that's another very complicated aspect of his life and the life of actually a lot of queer people, especially gay men, who lived for decades before Stonewall, and then were suddenly faced with this huge change, this political uprising, this social change, is very uncomfortable. And I think especially if you lived in the West Village like James did, the West Village was a place where gay people had carved out a kind of safe enclave. There was a page one story in the New York Times, I think in 1964, so maybe about 5 years before Stonewall. And it was this huge expose, like that, that Greenwich Village was full of gay people, living normal lives. It was this very sensational kind of homophobic story, expose. It was like, the person behind next to you on the subway, could be gay, and you wouldn't even know it. And they've infiltrated fashion. They've infiltrated art. So the climate, even in the 1960s, not long before Stonewall, that was the climate even as, enlightened a place as New York City. But the Village was a place where people could carve out some degree of safety if they were very discreet about it. I talked to a few sources who said, back then, even in the 1970s, even after Stonewall, you had a completely compartmentalized life. You had to. I mean, even at work, if you suspected, or even if you knew that somebody who worked in the same office as you might be gay, there was so much fear, like you wouldn't even sort of wink at each other, in the lunchroom over the water cooler, or mention something to each other, try to connect with people. It was too risky. There were no job protections. You could lose your job. Your life could be over, essentially. But at nights and on weekends in Greenwich Village, people could get together. People could have a completely cordoned off private life. So to have something like the Stonewall Rebellion happen, where, suddenly there was a civil rights movement that talked about coming out publicly, and in fact, coming out was a political act. Coming out publicly was a political act. It was a tremendously challenging moment for people. And there was just a lot of anger too. Like, how dare these kids, how dare these, kids in drag and trans women, coming down from the Bronx, into our world that we built to be safe. And they're just upsetting all of that. So it wasn't like, yay, Stonewall, we're all free. It was extremely challenging for people, especially people who had kind of amassed some privilege, like James Beard, and professional white men who had carved out a life in the Village. It was an extremely frightening time.
You mentioned some of his failed careers in acting and opera and such, but he of course went into both cooking and in teaching and being a public face of really a new way of thinking about American food. How did that universe, that industry, that the people in it, including some other famous names, we come to know Julia Child and others, how did they react to the gays and lesbians among them? I mean, was this you think of certain industries as being kind of LGBTQ friendly. How was it for James Beard?
Well, the food world in the United States was extremely small. So the circle of cookbook authors, food writers, editors of cookbooks, publishers, it was extremely small, and it was essentially all centered in New York City. So, even though James was not out publicly, it was an open secret to the small circle of food people in New York City that he was gay. I mean, that would have been impossible to hide. It was open to allowing gay people to work and socialize in that world. And there were, in fact, quite quite a number of gay and lesbian people who worked in food media, but there were very, very strict rules. And the rule that nobody could break or bend was that you did not come out. You did not expose who you were in any way. Like you didn't even joke about it. And those rules were all made by people who were straight for the most part, who controlled the industry. It reflected broader society. American society was like that as well. But the food world was, especially interesting because there were so many kind of closeted queer people who were sort of making kind of architects in a way of American food culture, but they had to remain closeted. There's this great generational shift. One of the sources for my book knew James Beard. He's a man named Billy Cross, and he and his partner Michael James unfortunately has passed away in the 1990s, but they had met at Chez Panisse restaurant where Billy worked, and Michael came in as a customer, and they were, in their early 20s. They fell in love. They became a couple, and Michael James was the assistant for Simone Beck, who had been Julia Child's co-author for Mastering the Art of French Cooking. And so they were friends with James Beard. And in 1972, Billy and Michael James came to New York City, and there was a new French consul in New York City. So there was a big, lavish reception, and they were all invited to go. And so Michael and Billy arrive at James Beard's house. They were going to go to the party as a couple. And James Beard never went to any event without a woman on his arm. I mean, everybody in New York food knew that, he was not romantically involved with any of these women, but that's just what you did. The culture demanded that you sort of at least keep up appearances that you were straight. And so, James Beard had his date for the evening, this woman, Frances Field, and James sort of pulled Michael and Billy aside, pulled the boys aside and said, "Where are your dates?" And they said, "We're each other's dates." And James was like, this is 1972, he said, "You can't do that. You're at the start of your careers. This will destroy your careers. You have to, it's ridiculous, but you have to play along. This is just the way it is. I didn't write these rules, but these are the rules." They said, "Screw it. We're just going as a couple." So, you can see that kind of, post Stonewall generational shift. But, the New York food world was very invested in this idea that you had to keep up appearances. Julia Child is someone who was very close to James Beard. They were very good friends, but, there are documented cases of Julia's homophobia, casual and maybe not so casual, homophobia. And it was just accepted. And if you stepped out of the lines, if you stepped out of line, if you didn't play along with these very strict gender and social conventions, you were ostracized from this world, from this industry.
And I wonder if that was really kind of burned into James Beard by the experience that he had in college. And could you explain to our viewers what happened to him in college and the end result of that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, for James Beard, the risk of what could happen if you came out wasn't just theoretical. I mean, it wasn't something that he would have read about. He had very direct experience. He had a very close call with something that could have ruined his life. He enrolled at Reed College in Portland, Oregon in 1921. And Reed College was still a new institution, is still a very progressive university, and it was, at the time, it was sort of established to be very open and progressive. It had 50% female students, which was almost unheard of, in the 1920s. It, accepted Jewish students. So it was very, as I say, progressive in many ways. James Beard, being the young aspiring actor, away from home, lived on campus, and sort of really kind of feeling himself, went to a Halloween party in drag, felt like he could express himself at Reed College, and even perhaps come out in some way. He had a romantic attachment with a male professor, the young head of the German department, and they were actually discovered having sex one Sunday afternoon. And this became a huge problem potentially for the university. Portland was a pretty politically conservative place. At that time, it was, dominated by Republican politics and had this kind of Republican populism. And gay people, especially gay men, were seen as a kind of, degenerate group of people who were trying to seduce, honest young men. And so Reed College was a private institution, and it depended on donations from supporters in Portland. And so, the last thing that Reed College needed when it was just starting up was a huge gay scandal. There'd been a major gay sex scandal in Portland in 1912. And it ended many lives. Many men were prosecuted and put in jail. And so James Beard, and a few of these men had actually been friends of James Beard's mother's. So he knew firsthand what the consequences of being caught, being exposed were. Reed College came up with a solution, probably actually a very progressive solution for the time, which, instead of involving authorities, which also would have put Reed College on the front page of newspapers and some sort of sex scandal, which they didn't want, they decided to take care of it quietly. So James was allowed to, after only 1 year at Reed, he was allowed, he was expelled. The reason being that he was, deficient in scholarship was how they put it. But actually it was a convenient way of having him step away. The professor, after that term, was basically fired, and he never taught again. So this was something that reverberated through James's life. James created a lot of myths about himself, and he would talk about his past and sort of change the facts to make his life seem perhaps grander or more important than it was. He never, there's no recorded instance of him even mentioning to anyone that he went to Reed College until it was much later, until he was in his 70s. So it was a really kind of defining moment of his life, really searing moment in his life that he never wanted to talk about. So the fear, the fear and consequences were real for James. It wasn't just sort of losing a job or being embarrassed for James. It was this real trauma that he had known as a boy, that he'd seen as a boy, of having your whole life ruined for being exposed.
I think that's what I enjoy the most about the book that you put together here, The Man Who Ate Too Much, The Life of James Beard, is the drawing, or this connection that you draw of what queer people go through when they're faced with that type of trauma. and having to go through the pain of living several different personalities or lives in these systems that oppress us. So from James's experiences in college to working in even trying to make it in theater, but then getting to a place where even the politics, the environment is not necessarily LGBTQ friendly or queer friendly, we should say, up until this very, at the end of his life, as you had mentioned, he kind of was a tragic figure. I think that there is a James Beard in all of us as queer people. I think we kind of always continuously go through that, kind of questioning what more can we give this world that isn't necessarily made for us. And so I kind of wanted to ask you yourself, John, or John Birdsall, John B, not John Z. But I mean, I guess all of us could say it. I mean, we're all queer here on the program. If you agree with that, if maybe that was a connection for you and that you saw that the James Beard story was not being told appropriately.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I kind of came up in my career through restaurant kitchens. Before I started writing, I cooked professionally for many years. And, of course, I cooked with tons of queer people in the kitchen, the most sort of creative, not to mention the most wonderful people that I ever, cooked with were queer cooks. And yet, even in San Francisco, where I did most of my cooking, even in San Francisco in the 1980s, 1990s, it was not safe to be too out in the kitchen. And so part of my motivation for writing this biography of James Beard was this sense of outrage. I think I used the word rage in the introduction to my book, this feeling like, so much of American food culture, so much of what's wonderful about American food culture was built by queer people working in restaurant kitchens and also, writing cookbooks, being on television, doing cooking demos. But we've had to be, for so many years, we've had to be second-class citizens in the kitchen. We've had to not be able to be fully who we were, express who we were. And that seemed like, partly it seemed like a cruel irony, especially at the, fine dining level of cooking, where so much of the story of restaurants was about the chef sort of expressing their life story through their food, expressing who they are, expressing some sense of authenticity. And it made me so angry and terribly sad that so many people in the industry who were queer weren't able to do that, fully. And so originally, when I wrote the essay, America, Your Food is So Gay, my motivation had been to kind of redress that injustice and say, hey, every chef I knew, straight, gay, whatever, wanted to win the James Beard Award. That's like the pinnacle of career success. And chefs who had run homophobic kitchens. And I felt, like the irony of a homophobic chef craving this medal that had an image of James Beard, who had this really tortured life, not being able to truly express who he was. And so originally with that essay, and then in this biography, I really wanted to correct that. I really wanted to depict queerness through food, in this way that I hadn't seen before. And, we've been sort of talking a lot about James's sadness and dysfunction in his life. But, the way that James's life was joyful and the way that he made it joyful for so many of us was through food, through this culture of food and enjoyment and celebration. I see one of the things James Beard was doing in the Village when he was not being totally out was having these really ecstatic, joyful, Sunday brunches with his queer circle, and really using food as this medium of joy and celebration, but also of kinship, in a way that we, especially as queer people, understand, that you gather the people around you who are really your family, who really understand you, who really allow you to be who you are. And I see all of that in James Beard's accomplishments. And he taught America to do that, even though they didn't really know that it was something that was cooked up in his gay kitchen.
I was going to say, I think a queer person, if not James Beard, invented brunch.
Yeah, completely. And and these brunches would just go on for hours. And of course, there was just drinking, there was just food coming out of the oven, and in a completely unpretentious way. And that was also new for the most part in sort of high level American food. I mean, it'd been happening in other people's homes, but just that idea that, food is purely about enjoyment. And yeah, so many, I even sort of found some recipes in some of his later books that had this sort of queer chain of, that sort of reflected this kind of queer migration of the 20th century, gay men and queer women who had to leave the sort of small towns all over America where they were, came to New York City, became friends with James Beard, and would sort of bring this family heirloom, like, this lemon cake that my grandmother in Texas always made, that, of course, the person's cut off from because they can't really go back to Texas once they've come out in New York City. So it has this, James published those recipes. He didn't tell those stories, but he would just be like, this wonderful Texas lemon cake. But it has this whole story, this whole queer story of, migration, of sort of joy mixed with sadness. And I've just found so much of that in James's story. That it sort of kept me really inspired.
He did not come out until, 1981? Is that correct?
He never came out publicly. That's that's something. I know the source of that information, and it's not.
Okay.
Yeah, he contemplated coming out publicly. In the late 1970s, and yeah, after Stonewall, he did feel drawn to come out, but by that time, he had a major cookbook editor and his major publisher at Knopf. He had a lot of people writing on his books selling, and James Beard died in 1985. I mean, that was the same year that we all found out that not only that Rock Hudson had been dealing with AIDS, but of course it was irrefutable that he was gay, and that was a huge scandal. And so you can see the consequences of somebody really famous coming out in the early 80s. I mean, it would have been a scandal. It would have really affected his popularity and his book sales. And there were so many people invested in him not coming out, who were making money off of James Beard. And this would have been a major hit to his viability as a commercial entity. So yeah, he wanted to, but he never actually did.
Has the restaurant industry changed since then? Is it less homophobic?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it is. I mean, and now in 2021, who knows? I don't even know where the industry stands. Where it will be when we come out from this moment. But yeah, recently things have changed, although, at the very highest, the so-called highest level, where there's, more money, more investors, more money riding on restaurants, there's still people are still reticent to be fully out. It's a very complicated dynamic, and I also don't want to criticize people whose life experiences I haven't had, but yeah, there's a great reluctance. There's still a homophobic culture that hasn't completely left the restaurant industry. There's a great deal of reticence. For some reason, which I have tried to report on in past stories, there's just been this fear that if you are pegged as a queer chef, that you are less respected in the industry, that your food can't be top notch. There's still a very Euro French derived, militarized culture of kitchen organization, where the chef is the ultimate authority. There's a kind of military discipline in really high-end kitchens. They're not collaborative spaces, haven't been spaces where people could come out and say, chef, I really take exception to the way that you're, joking about queer people, or, that sort of gets you kicked out of the kitchen. And there's so much competition to be in kitchens, just even as unpaid interns, that it's hard for people to risk their careers by being too vocal. So things have changed. There are definitely more women, more out queer people, more people of color in high-end kitchens, but still not nearly enough to really change the culture in ways that it needs to be changed.
James Beard, of course, made his career at a very specific time in American history. You talked about the change in the early part of this century, or the past century, from more agrarian, more local food to very corporatized and say corporatized food. So I want to ask two questions. One is, do you think, having now gone through all that we've gone through over the past now 70 years or so of development and adapting and more immigration and more adoption of different things, do you think there could ever be another person who has the impact of James Beard to really kind of reorient to the way that Americans, whatever percentage of Americans were his audience, the way that they think about food and cooking and presenting?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, part of James Beard's story is he was really only possible in a food world that was very, very top down, that had a lot of gatekeepers, where is very kind of definitely white and affluent. There were these arbiters of culture, including of food culture, who said what it was. And James Beard sort of defied that in many ways. He sort of broke through this brittle, high-end gourmet culture of the day, of the 1950s, and got Americans to eat in a different way. But it's a very... It doesn't truly take into account the diversity of American food, and even the diversity of American food at the time when James Beard was writing. Especially after he wrote his book, this great book, James Beard's American Cookery, in 1972, he was always asked to define American food. What's American food? What's American food? And at some point, he just said, well, it's whatever people in America eat, whatever Americans eat. Because, American food, even in the 1950s, was something that couldn't be defined. I mean, people pretended to. They said it was sort of French, or it was this sort of Anglo-American hybrid. It didn't take into account, the history of Black cooks in the South, or of, Asian American cooks, especially on the West Coast. And, it was very Western European and very white. So in many ways, we have moved beyond that idea of American food, that narrow idea of American food, meaning that somebody like James Beard would not be possible again. Thank God there's just too much diversity that we're all happy about and living with and have incorporated into our lives, where that wouldn't be possible. Having said that, I do feel that there are figures right now who have the kind of appeal of James Beard. I think of Samin Nosrat, someone who is unexpected in many ways. Samin's rise to popularity has been a wonderful thing to watch. It's someone, she's not like the typical stars of Food Network. She seems completely fresh. She comes from, she's got this complicated, diverse background that she can talk about, and this just unpretentious love of food that is infectious in the way that she, talks and laughs. That's someone who, James Beard very much had an appeal like that to Americans in the 1950s. Someone who just seemed completely, typically American in this sense of being, unpretentious and fresh and like bubbly and just in love with food and with life. So I think somebody couldn't have the same authority and reach over, so many years and over so many people as James Beard, but there are certainly people who have this appeal that James Beard, who can sort of make us all want to cook, who can make us all fall in love with going to the farmer's market and kind of wanting to find delicious things and cook for the people we love. So
I'm going to add on top of that, a great American figure. I think part of our history and part of our politics. And you should definitely grab the book if you haven't done so. The Man Who Ate Too Much: The Life of James Beard by John Birdsall. John and I have our special copy. Thank you so much, John. One of the things I think we started with before we began the program is John and I talked about how people were really impressed and loved the way that you wrote the autobiography. I, for one, thought about, I wonder what lengths he went to get so much information about James Beard. Yeah.
I have to say that it was kind of an obsession, which I'm not totally proud of. My husband certainly felt it because I was so absorbed in James Beard for so many years. But I tried to absorb anything that I could find. There were a dwindling number of sources who knew James Beard, who I could speak with. So I had to do a lot of archival research. But I wanted to immerse people in the time when James Beard lived, what it felt like to be on the Oregon coast in 1915 or in New York City in 1955. And so I just looked at as much material as I could to really kind of immerse myself and immerse the reader in that, old films, photographs, other contemporary accounts. I being the biographer of a queer subject who lived at a time when they couldn't be out, and in fact, destroyed a lot of valuable information, like letters and things like that they felt were too incriminating. Being a queer biographer is, there's a special level of archaeology that's called for. You have to look not only at the material that's out there, but you have to look at the erasure marks in somebody's life, the things that they tried to cover up, tried to hide. So I spent a lot of time trying to find those things, and then seeing if I could find a pattern, seeing if I could find meaning. And I kind of took it as a mission to correct or address what I felt was an injustice of a queer subject feeling like they had to hide. So I felt a special responsibility to go find these clues, and bring them to light.
So you've written a very well-received book now on James Beard, and you yourself are a 2-time James Beard Award winner. Maybe this book will win you your 3rd. But I could see some people kind of know that and thinking, okay, well, this is going to be a puff piece on James Beard. But it's not. You do show, you do talk about some problems in his character and some of the actions he did and stuff like that. Did the James Beard connection, you as a laureate, did that play any role in either you getting access to people to talk to, or just in your focusing of the book in any direction?
Well, perhaps people were more willing to talk with me, but I don't actually think so. In some ways, the awards and the foundation are quite distant from James Beard, the person. So there wasn't necessarily a direct connection. I did have some great help from the James Beard Foundation, some archival materials that they had. I knew going into this biography that there were some very dark places in James Beard's life. That he did many ugly things that it would be impossible, even if a biographer wanted to kind of justify or to explain or condone. And I certainly had no intention of doing that. And I felt that a large part of my job was to lay out facts and information as I found it, and not to, in the same way that I wouldn't condone, say, James's sexual exploitation of younger men. I didn't want to try to somehow explain that or come up with a justification for it. But I didn't want to bring any kind of bias of mine into it. So what I wanted to do was just kind of listen to sources, look at evidence that I found, and just kind of lay it out for the reader. And if the reader, came upon those things and they're too painful and decided to walk away from the book, I would totally understand that. But the restaurant industry, like pretty much every other area of American life right now, the past 5 years, has been dealing with these kinds of stories, these revelations of sexual abuse, certainly Me Too stories. And the restaurant industry and the food business has started to take a look at those, but obviously still has a tremendous amount of work to do. And I hoped in some way that presenting James Beard in that context and describing that information, describing those stories of James's, abuse of younger men, his exploitation, might be, just another voice in this conversation. Certainly in the food industry, of coming to terms with it. I think even just kind of seeing how widespread it is helps in some way. I hope it helps people who felt victimized by that kind of thing in the restaurant industry feel like they're certainly not alone, because it's existed for a long time. So I don't know.
Yeah. No, that's all so great. And I think great words for even my last question, which I wasn't going to ask, but because you already made the point. I think for those, who know of James Beard, who want that award or want to learn more about James Beard, I think, learning about him and our history is so important for the work that we need to do going forward. John Birdsall, thank you so much for joining us here in the Commonwealth Club, and all of you out there who joined us. Yes, I definitely think this needs to be in everybody's bookshelf. The more we know, the more we can make those changes. John Zipper, you have the last words.
Well, thank you everyone for watching and listening to this program. You can find out more Michelle Meow shows at commonwealthclub.org/MMS. So have a good end of your week and a good weekend, and we look forward to seeing you guys in person again one day. Thank you.